You mentioned two issues that I heard, right? So one is your sister dating this guy, right? And you're protecting her, right? You're concerned about her. Has your sister ever asked you for your advice or opinion or anything about her boyfriend? Because and the reason why I asked that is that if you're expressing your opinions and your advice to her when she's never asked you, it's not really going to be something that she's going to necessarily like heed your advice. I am a firm believer that we don't like unless people ask for our opinions or our advice about something, I rarely give it out. Or if I feel strongly about it, I'll ask them, may I have permission to speak into it? And if they say yes, great. But if they say no, like I don't need to give advice to people that aren't asking for it. The big difference though is that you know your value, right? And it sounds like your sister doesn't necessarily know the value to the degree that you know your value, right? I think it's a little bit kind of tricky because it's this really interesting relationship of like, you are your sister's sister, but you also work with her boyfriend, because I know that it's, and I'm not necessarily assuming that you're going to do this, but like keeping your conversation to the boyfriend, like very strictly about you and your business relationship with him. I think that if your sister's not asking for you to like, speak on her behalf about how you feel he treats her, then it's kind of like creating that, maintaining that boundary and respect for your sister, right? Like I think outside of like extreme examples of like physical or emotional abuse, I won't necessarily have conversations with people. But if it is physical or emotional abuse, like you best be sure like I'll have those conversations with people, even if people don't ask me to. If I were you, I would really spend a lot of that time and energy, because you have that concern of him not treating her well, really just lifting her up, encouraging her to look into herself and find value and discover the value, like affirming her of really what her value is, right? A lot of times that's what helps too, is sometimes people can't find it within themselves, but if other people share it with them, they might actually believe it a little bit more, right? When we want someone to change so badly and they don't, right, we have a choice of how much energy we want to spend to try to convince them to see their own value, right? But I think that one question that you really have to ask yourself also is, how much control are you trying to look for? Because you're trying to change her and you're trying to change her behavior, right? Or do you really want to spend more time and energy helping her to realize her value? Or are you trying to change hers and to change her behavior, right? That's really, I think, a lot of times when we're like, oh, but I'm so tired of listening to them, I'm not saying that you're trying to control. Are we much rather looking to control the person and have them change? Or are we trying to help them to see their value? You don't have any control over her nor her boyfriend. Wow, that was really hard to say. Maintain the boundaries for yourself too, of like, your sister didn't ask you to have a conversation to him about her, right? But you, because you work with him, could let him know, right? And it's up to you in your conversation of whether or not you want to continue to work for him. And I think that's the challenge, right? Because there is like that kind of intertwining of these relationships. You can conduct a conversation in a way that is respectful and loving, but also firm, right? Boundaries need to be firm. Otherwise, people are just going to walk over, break over the fence and just like, right? We can't have like this weak fence, weak boundary. We need to have a pretty strong boundary. So I don't know if you would be willing to take a little bit of a deeper dive. I am always a person of context. So when I conduct like my therapy sessions, it's hard for me to kind of give like advice or recommendation if I don't know a little bit more context, because then I can give you like, for example, like scripts, or we can kind of work it out a little bit. I think there's a couple of layers here, right? I think first of all, and Jen Shelton was saying like, you took the higher road, right? And you absolutely did. And I think it's one of those things where it goes back to your value, right? And we've talked about this one-on-one before, right? It's like, you're more valuable than you give yourself credit for. It's challenging, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about, just your past, and unfortunately that influences us a lot of times, right? Like our wounds from our past, sometimes we've allowed it to dictate how we see ourselves. So the deeper work has to start with knowing your value first and foremost, right? Going back to that whole like, Tiffany's versus swap meet example, because without that, it's gonna be really hard to create boundaries because you don't know the value. I think that everyone has their kind of different journeys of what that looks like. Even within like this Zoom and within sub 2, maybe just connecting with some people that you have built relationships with and just say like, hey, like, I know that this might sound like a weird question, but like, what is the value that you see in me? It's a super vulnerable question, right? But I'm sure that you have close friends and family, regardless of like, their understanding or beliefs of like you pursuing real estate, but just, I'm sure that you're a really, really strong person, actually stronger than you probably give yourself credit for. Because in the conversations that we had, like the level of your perspective on life and your positivity, that comes from the work that you've done in your life and the strength that you've built. So first and foremost, like that in and of itself is something that I hope that you can believe for yourself. And it's reaching out to your friends and family and just asking that question. It's a little bit vulnerable. I always like to say, when Caroline Kane says like, write your oh shit wall and your vision wall, like write your truth wall. And I've had many conversations with people about that, of like, write a truth wall of, when someone speaks an affirmation into you and into your life, like write that down, because that's a script that we need to actually memorize and remember for ourselves instead of being reactive to the negativity. You're incredibly strong for everything that you've gone through. You're incredibly strong and you're resilient and you're a kind person despite everything that you've gone through. I've known so many other people that have experienced probably less than what you've experienced, and they're just like really, really, really mean people, and you're not, right? I think that what you did to that person, and that's kind of related to your business, is like, that's not you, right? But you were kind of being reactive because your business partner, you felt a certain way and you became reactive to that, right? But that's not truly you. I'm a firm believer in humility. And I think that if you didn't feel that that was really you, even just backtracking and say, I don't know if you want to have a conversation with her, right, about it, but just saying like, I'm sorry that I did that. That was not me. And I didn't mean to do that for you. I don't know. Again, I'm not saying that you have to do that, right? But conversation though, of like, once you know your value, is letting people know like, hey, when you speak to me that way, like, I'm not cool with that. I don't deserve to be treated that way. And if they make excuses so they have two choices, right? When you confront someone and you create a boundary, they could either acknowledge that, even if they weren't intentional about it, which is like kind of a complete BS, but like, even if they weren't intentional about it, that if you create that boundary, they could either say, you know what, I'm sorry that I made you feel that way, or that you felt that way. And they could acknowledge it, ask for forgiveness and apologize, or they can make excuses, right? And you have a choice, right? Because again, the whole idea behind boundaries is not to control someone's behavior, but it's letting people know what your value is and that they can't mistreat you. It really comes down to, without knowing your value, the boundaries that we create for ourselves are not going to be strong enough. And that's the longer road, right? But it's a worthwhile road to take. I like the analogy of like replacing a tape deck, right? It's like, that's what we're doing, is that we're replacing a tape deck. We have this tape deck of the things that we've experienced in the past, have created this tape deck of like negativity of how we see ourselves. And what affirmations does is it's trying to play a louder script than the negativity that we've had. Right? It's surrounding yourself with people that believe in you and want to affirm you and want to speak blessings into your life. Creating boundaries maybe doesn't necessarily even need to be where you're having a conversation, but if you have such toxic people in your life, maybe the conversation won't even resonate with them. And so it's just backing away in our lives that are so toxic that it's like, when you have a conversation, it might not be worth your time and energy. It just depends on who they are, right? So, but the reason why I'm like kind of separating like the different relationships is that the dynamics are always different, right? So I think for me, like, my first immediate recommendation would be just to test the waters, share a little bit. You're not going to reveal all your cards, but you're going to, share a little bit. Right. And then depending on how they respond, you kind of know a little bit of like where they're at. Right. I haven't actually, I have a close relationship with my brother and sister-in-law. But like, I haven't really shared too much with them. And then when I make posts, my brother's like, dude, I started following Pace and, cool. Like, can you help me get a property in Joshua Trees? It's testing the waters, right? For each of those relationships. Some might, be a little bit more willing to have a conversation and show curiosity and respond in a more positive manner. Some might not be, right? And it's up to you, right? It's again, it comes back to knowing your value. It sounds like, part of it too is, maybe not necessarily wanting to share is because you're on a journey of strengthening, your own mind of the value that you see in yourself. Sometimes that's part of it too. Like I love sharing about my wins because I'm like, I don't know, maybe I'm just a little bit arrogant and believe a little bit too much in myself, right? But it's like, I feel like, that's part of it too, is that maybe not sharing is good for your own protection, but that's up to you, right? It's a direct correlation. Like the amount of value that you see in yourself, right, will directly correlate to how much you would want to share, and also how much you would want to create a boundary for yourself. So I think, to answer your question, it depends on the relationship that you have with each person. And then I would say just test the waters. And if they respond in a way that's negatively, it's your assessment of where you're at in that season or in that moment to understand, well, okay, well, my value is here and they don't see my value. So you can either, one, communicate that to them, or number two, just kind of like what Mike was doing, just slowly kind of back away and not maybe share as much with them. You have to know yourself even in that moment, right? I think that's like another one of those things of like being like just kind of mindful of where you're at in any given moment. Like you have the freedom to decide if you're not feeling like you're optimal, right? And like strong enough in that moment to like withhold a boundary, and that they might be impacted, that you might be impacted by their negativity, don't share, right? That's your choice to make, right? But again, I'm a firm believer in like being proactive as opposed to being reactive, because we waste a lot more time and energy being reactive to things and being pissed off and offended and, defensive, right? But it's like, if you know yourself and you're like, if they're like, you kind of almost have to like predict it and say, you know what, like I kind of like, my parents they just arrived in the house, and my husband and I, like, we're going to have a very interesting conversation of like updating them about our real estate, because they're probably going to ask. And I told my husband, I said, I was like, they're probably not going to believe in what we're doing, and they're probably not going to encourage us. And he's like, are you kidding me? They're not going to encourage us at all. And I was like, okay, that's good. Like, I know, and I'm aware, right? Bless my husband's heart. Like, he's going to have that conversation with them, and I'm just going to like be in the background, like trying to breathe through the conversation. But in each of those relationships that you mentioned with like your father and your brother and, a friend, you have different dynamics and different relationships with them. Share if you want to, don't share if you don't want to. And if they ask, right, then you can say, yeah, like I'm just doing stuff, right? I'm having a great time. Right. And if they ask a little bit more, but they don't respond in a respectful, positive manner, where they stand in that moment. Right. And then you can decide whether or not you want to share moving forward. But it's not, it's like, don't waste your time and energy trying to convince them. Right. Every person's journey in this space of like having a W-2 in real estate, like it all depends on like your assets. So your assets is time and money and energy. Part of it is consistency, right? Like Pace always talks about like 90 days. If you haven't done and worked at a plan for 90 days, you haven't been consistent. And that's the challenge, right? You have to look at it, right? You've done it before, right? You've created, actions that are like sprint like, right? Because you want to try to just do as much as you can in that moment until you gain enough traction to where you feel like you can quit your W-2 and pursue this full time. It's more of like a strategy of a long game. I've had a lot of conversations with people. There's actually more people probably that are in your situation of having a job and trying to pursue real estate full time, then there are people that are like just fully doing real estate. I'm pretty sure I've had many conversations with people where they have that. It sounds like the boundaries, in speaking about the topic of boundaries, a lot of the boundaries it sounds like it's needing to develop even within your own mind. When we think about like, if you're sprinting, right? If you sprint, the pain that you experience is like short lived. The mindset and the boundaries that you need to create, like if you firmly believe, like, you know what, you tell yourself, Danielle, like I can do this, how you want to use your time and energy. If you want a cold call, do it. If you don't want to, pivot to something else where you feel that you can scale. I don't know exactly what your situation looks like. I think unfortunately, like I don't have enough experience, in the real estate investing space to be able to like create a solid game plan per se in regards to like what that looks like for you to scale. Pace always talks about like there's a million ways that you could succeed in real estate. And it's like, but it's like, what I love what you just said. It's like, well, if I know right now that I'm in a season where I need to wholesale in order to like build, the income, sustain my, living and all that stuff, like I'm going to wholesale right now. I'm not going to talk to like, people who are doing Airbnbs. I'm not going to talk to people who are wholesaling, different things that I'm not wholesaling, right? Like there's so much wisdom in that. So one big thing that Pace always encourages, providing value and just like giving to the community. And you have a lot to give. Thank you all for spending Saturday mornings with me, and have a wonderful week.